we have a fantastic panel coming up for you right now on this main channel here. It is Live and Let Live with Christopher Snowden, Eric Crampton and Kate Andrews. And Eric, I believe we're starting with you. The world seems to have gone mad as we're all of a sudden being almost run by these health nannies. These people used to be advisors. Now it feels like they've got more power than presidents and prime ministers.
What in the world is going on? What is your take on all of this?
Well, you're right. The world is going crazy, and it's been going crazy for rather some time. And it's really been annoying me. I'm an economist, and just the abuse of economic method that you see in the work that some of these guys do in trying to justify controls and all the rest of us, it infuriates me. And that's why I started getting involved in this sort of line of work a decade and a half ago. So as an economist, we take some kinds of costs as mattering for policy purposes, and other ones are just, well, they're just cost, right? So if you're imposing costs on somebody else, well, maybe there's some reason for the government to get involved. Like if I decide that I want to start punching Chris, well, he's got some good reason to stop me from doing that, or having the government act on his behalf to stop me from punching him. I'm not going to try that because he's way before me. But the principle behind it, cost you impose on yourself, well, there's not really a policy problem there. Cost you impose on other people without their consent, that can be a public policy problem. If Chris and I had a charity boxing match, that wouldn't be a public policy problem because it's all voluntary, right? But what's been coming out from the public health guys is more of a view that health is the only permissible goal, and that nobody can really have any goal in life other than life expectancy maximization, maybe healthy life expectancy maximization. But really, if you could eke out another 3 decades of being spoon-fed and pureed mush, that's really good, and that's what we should be aiming for. And anything that lets you get those extra few years at the end that are miserable, that's all worthwhile.
You make it sound so appealing.
Well, not to me, but
No.
I think health is the only permissible goal. You get into some weird places, right? So imagine you see a lot of this work done in alcohol, and that's where I focused my research. But just take skiing as an analogy, right? If you were to start thinking about, well, what are the social costs of skiing, right? I'm in the middle of winter here in New Zealand, and we're not on lockdown anymore. So I was out with the kids skiing just a couple days ago. If you didn't think that the joy of skiing counted for anything, well, then you could start thinking, well, all of the money that you spend getting to the ski field, well, that's a pure cost, right? Or if you happen to fall down and hurt yourself, that's a pure cost because there's no offsetting enjoyment. And that's just a sheer abuse of the economic method. You're assuming that somebody who's voluntarily doing something gets no benefit out of it, right? So like, why would they be doing it? The underlying assumption is that people have wrong preferences or they're irrational in one way or another, and that's making them make these wrong choices. And because they're interpreting these costs then as being social costs, they're using some of the language of economics that can be used in sort of an Econ 101 lecture about, well, when the social costs are greater than the private costs, the government should come in and put in a tax or some other regulation or something to balance things out. Instead, these guys are assuming that there is no benefit. And when there's no benefit, every cost becomes a net cost because you've assumed the benefits to be equal to zero. So this leads to piles of just these crazy studies. You guys in Melbourne would be familiar with some of these. There's a number going around about a decade ago that alcohol costs Australia was at $15 billion. That was Collins and Lapsley came up with that number. I'd gone through that number in some depth after going through a similar New Zealand one. And the way that they get to those kinds of numbers is by assuming that drinkers get no enjoyment from their alcohol, that if you've had something to drink and then you go out and commit a crime afterwards, 100% of that crime was caused by alcohol. Like you'll survey people in prison and say, well, how much did alcohol contribute to your offending? Like completely, mostly, somewhat, not very much, or not at all. Well, if you say anything sort of in the moderate range is up, that's by definition an alcohol-caused crime in their analysis, right? So they start adding up all of the cost of all of this, lumping it all in, along with reduced life expectancy. So you'll ignore some of the health benefits of alcohol, although at least in the Australian case, they didn't do as bad of a job of that, and ignore all of the enjoyment, then present all of the resulting costs as being a cost to the public. But it's not really a cost to the public, right? If you're drinking to excess and you have a slightly shorter life expectancy, you can't really count the monetized value of that reduced life expectancy as some cost to the government or some cost to the public purse. But that's what these big numbers are designed to do. They're designed to come up with a scary figure that justifies higher taxes or more regulations or more reasons for the government to come in and control what you're doing. Because if what you're doing isn't just a private thing anymore, but a public one, because we've assumed that all of the costs that you impose on yourself or the costs that you impose through the public health system, which for an economist are just a transfer, like policy has decided that for some reason the government wants to pay for this, well, it's not really me putting costs on other people. It's the government having decided that the cost of me breaking a leg is something that should be borne through the tax system. So packaging these all up and making it sound like it's all these big costs to the government when really it's costs that people are imposing on themselves, badly measured, mismeasured, ignoring the benefits side, that drives policy into crazy places, right? Because if we have a bit of an innate, around here, we're all fairly classical liberal or libertarian or one variant of it or another. We're live and let live people. Not everybody is like that, unfortunately, but there'll be some innate sort of minor league version of it, right? That if you don't think that what I'm doing is costing you anything, like, why should I even worry about it, right? When you start packaging these things up, getting really, really crappy numbers to drive headlines on the ABC or here on Radio New Zealand, to make it sound like these other people, these bad drinkers, are costing you money. They're costing you through your taxes a whole pile of money. Well, that can give you a reason to start wanting to beat up on these people, right? Because you think that they're costing you something. And that's the whole point of these things. The other perverse implication that you get out of it is when you start tallying all the costs that people impose on themselves, you get a wrong rank ordering of where the costs are really falling. So in the Collins and Lapsley work, the biggest cost that they found was over $4 billion in loss of life. Now, they had some weird assumptions on how they got to that number, but these were largely costs that people are imposing on themselves, not like victims of drink driving accidents. It was people maybe living a month or two less than they otherwise might have. If you take a more standard economic approach, healthcare costs and crime costs were the ones that would lead. So if you're looking at interventions that are going to be targeted to the actual cost that people impose on others, you start thinking about, well, how do we deal with crime, right? And instead of putting taxes up for everybody, a buddy of mine in grad school, Ed Stringham, used to say that using alcohol excise taxes to try and stop crime is like using petrol excise to try and stop speeding. It's just a very badly targeted way of trying to solve the problem. Instead, you use speed cameras, right? You don't try and make everybody drive slower because the cost of petrol's gone up. Maybe, well, most people drive a little bit slower because you're trying to be a little bit more fuel efficient if petrol excise has gone up, but it's not really targeting the ones that are causing the problems. The ones that are causing the problems aren't going to care about that so much. And there are plenty of interventions that target crime that can work, but they take a bit more individual responsibility in, and that's the nanny guys. They don't like that. They want population level controls. They assume that nobody can be responsible for their own actions, and they would hate to have measures that try and bring some individual responsibility back. So as infuriating as all of that is for an economist, just because of the misuse of economic language, assuming that there's this huge theoretical apparatus that underlies what economists do, right? And they take the words from it, ignore all of the method that gets you there, and then present it as being the same thing. And just it's really maddening, but it gets even worse, right? So for the last couple of decades, all of the big action in public health has been in non-communicable disease. That's the big sexy stuff. That's where you can get the big grants from the public health granting agencies. And so you can get like multi-million-dollar grants here in New Zealand. That's a lot of money in New Zealand, at least in academia, for doing work on like having series of focus groups about what makes you think about smoking and whether you might want to switch to something that isn't smoking. They're not running those focus groups on how do we start talking to people who are reluctant to get vaccinated, right? If you're thinking about classic public health, like it all starts with trying to stop communicable disease, right? The old well pump that people were getting all sick from figure out how communicable disease works. All right, how do you start promoting vaccination to people who are a little bit skeptical of it? Maybe that's an actual public health, public policy problem as compared to telling me that I shouldn't have a beer. Right? How do we tell Eric that he shouldn't have a beer, even though he knows the literature that you minimize your all-source mortality by having a drink a day? Okay, you can have a pile of focus groups trying to stop me from drinking, or you can focus on actual communicable disease, public health problems. And the consequence here in New Zealand was that they abandoned the vaccination targets for our district health boards because they didn't really want to focus on that anymore. They were more interested in non-communicable diseases and telling people that they shouldn't eat fatty foods to try and reduce diabetes load or something. And after they abandoned the vaccination targets, vaccination rates went down. We had a measles outbreak last year, and we exported the measles to Samoa. So wasn't that a nice thing to have happen? Because we stopped caring about communicable disease. If there were any silver lining to that kind of dark cloud, it's that last year's measles outbreak, at least in New Zealand, kind of reminded people that communicable disease exists. So we might have been slightly better prepared for COVID as consequence, but that's like, you wouldn't want to base a system on that, right? Let's try and get measles to try and remind us that communicable disease exists. No, you need to shake the system up so that it focuses back on communicable disease instead of lifestyle issues. Get sensible measures around preventing transmission of communicable disease, especially around vaccination promotion. In New Zealand now, we're in sort of a lucky spot that we're basically COVID-free. Our lockdown wound up working, but we had just an incredible set of really, really, really lucky dice rolls on that. I'm not sure it's a gamble that could pay off for anybody else, but it has worked here, and now we can live a very free lifestyle. So we went harder and worse than everybody else. Now the controls here are much lighter, except that, well, we're stuck on an island and nobody can really go anywhere because managed isolation isn't scaling up. So all of the shift from communicable disease to non-communicable disease had us forget how to do some basic things, right? So it took a long time for New Zealand to remember how to do contact tracing, to remember how quarantine kind of works. Like, you know, you've got thousands of years of experience around quarantine, around plagues, things that have happened. It's not typically everybody has to stay in the house forever. It's more typically, okay, well, this house is a plague house and you can't come out of there now for a while. And maybe you're going to seal the town borders for a little while. But yeah, we've had millennia of experience with this. They kind of forgot how to do that. New Zealand was lucky because we got our cases late. So that's made us look pretty good because we were able to catch up pretty quick. But it could have all gone really, really bad. We got very, very lucky. Another really bad consequence of it is that because the public health folks have talked so much rubbish about so many things, we're used to ignoring them when they do manage to get a couple of things right, like mask wearing. Mask wearing seems to work. But when you've had folks like the CDC that pretend that EVALI, there's this vaping-related disorder, which was really caused by vitamin E acetate in adulterated black market THC sticks. When they were pretending that that was due to normal vaping, well, people start to lose confidence in these guys because they are just so used to whatever they're saying being utter rubbish, right? So it denigrates their own expertise when there are areas that they might know something about. It makes us forget how to deal with real public health problems as compared to these made-up ones, and it overall winds up harming liberty. It harms liberty during normal times because we're all told what to eat and drink, and then it harms liberty again when we do have a communicable disease outbreak because you start missing some of the better buys in preventing transmission and then getting back to a more normal way of life.
You actually, Eric. Just got a question for you, Eric. Do you see much potential for a corona immunity passports? And is there much that libertarians can do to defend our privacy and security? That's come from one of our viewers.
I don't think anybody knows yet how long resistance will stay. So there's debate about whether it's in the T cells or in the immune response in the serological test that you can get. I don't know how long that resistance is going to last. What I would love to see is, like, even immunity passports can work in places where you have had the bigger outbreaks. We're not going to see it here. We had put out a short policy report very early on in this saying, if this does run, you're going to want to very quickly find the people who have recovered from it and get them onto the front lines in helping in the health system, right? Because they're not going to be, at least they're going to have some immunity for a while. And you're going to want to get those people into places like meatpacking works and the other spots where transmission seems a lot easier. At least for me here in New Zealand, it's not something that I've had to worry about recently because we basically got it down. And so long as managed isolation keeps working at the border, we're going to be okay. Oh, I just had my buzzer go off that I had to remind me to not go over 15 minutes. Apologies for that. There is potential for it, and especially for directing people to the places where having immunity would make a lot of sense. It would probably take fairly frequent retesting to make sure that immunity is maintained.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for all of that input. We are going to have plenty of more questions for you and for all the panelists towards the end of the session. But let's switch across now to Chris and hear your thoughts on this topic of the way that, I guess, health nannies have somehow managed to become the boss.
Well, they've become almost like saints now, you know, like in the UK, go out and clap the NHS.
Yes.
Bizarre.
Chris?
Thank you. Nice to be here. Well, they're certainly, they're not saints to me. I mean, the COVID-19 outbreak came as a shock to everybody. I think it particularly came as a shock to the public health movement, lobby, industry, call it what you will. And I think it's shown up, what I would call the legacy public health movement, as not being equipped to do the one thing that is supposed to be their number one priority. Now, some people would make the argument that it's all right for these guys to be dabbling in, you know, telling people how much to drink and whether they should be vaping or consuming sugary drinks if they get the core work done. I disagree with that. I don't think it's any of the government's business, but I can see that argument. With COVID, from the very top level, you've seen these guys unequipped to deal with infectious diseases. And that's what public health is. You know, for years, I've been putting the term public health in kind of scare quotes to differentiate it from traditional real public health, which is the prevention of contagious and infectious diseases. That stuff is a legitimate focus of government intervention because it requires collective action. You know, and even libertarians would accept the need sometimes for illiberal measures. I wrote before the lockdown began in Britain about how, you know, actually libertarians do not or should not have an objection even to lockdowns because there is harm to others. It's a John Stuart Mill thing, really. You know, somebody who's walking around with a potentially fatal infectious disease is a risk to others, and we would tolerate more draconian action in instances like that than we should do if it's just a matter of somebody being fat. Now, in a way, despite the horrendous nature of the problem, in the early days of this epidemic, I saw kind of a silver lining insofar as I was hoping it might lead to reform of public health. I'm not so sure that's what's actually going to happen for reasons I'll come to in a moment, but it did at least remind people what a genuine public health problem was. It reminded us what an epidemic was. This is a word that's been misused. We talk about the childhood obesity epidemic and stuff like this. These things are not epidemics. At the worst, they're endemic. And in the case of childhood obesity, pretty much fictitious. It was refreshing to see epidemiologists on the television who actually studied epidemics rather than the people who watch soap operas and count the number of times somebody is seen drinking alcohol or something like this, or trying to connect blueberries to cancer. And I kind of thought that because people suddenly realized what a real public health problem was, then we might see the rest of it as the trivial, illiberal nonsense that it is. Two organizations in particular have really been shown up by this. Public Health England, I won't bore on about England too much because obviously most of the viewers are not from there, but I suspect that most viewers will have similar organizations in their own country who fall into a similar trap. Public Health England actually has a bigger budget than the World Health Organization. And it has spent the last 7 years since it was created banging on about sugar taxes, minimum pricing for alcohol, smoking, and so on. Its stated primary objective is to protect the public from infectious diseases. it has got everything wrong. Everything it was asked to do, it has got wrong. It had a pandemic preparation plan that was entirely based on the assumption that the virus would behave like flu. It not only advised people against wearing face masks, it actually advised our advertising regulator to ban adverts for face masks that encouraged people to buy them on the basis that it would reduce the risk of infection. It seemed to have some kind of responsibility for providing personal protective equipment. We in Britain had a terrible crisis with personal protective equipment. We didn't have any, even for medics. We've since spent £10 billion trying to catch up on that. The other organization is the World Health Organization, and the problems of that particular agency over the last few months are fairly well known. It clearly gave the world a false sense of security about this virus because it was so keen to flatter the Chinese Communist Party. It was against, I think still is against, travel bans. And from the very outset, it was against travel bans. Its advice now is that they're still against travel bans, except in the early stage of an epidemic where they might be helpful. Well, unfortunately, they didn't say that in the early stages of this epidemic. If it advised travel bans to and from Wuhan, at least, things would have been very different, I think, over the course of this epidemic. It too has been against face masks. I think, like a lot of agencies, it's done a bit of a U-turn on that, but it certainly put people off initially. The politics of the whole organization, you know, it's run by a guy who was part of a basically Maoist revolutionary group and was its health minister and so on for a long time. The WHO has an issue with Hong Kong and Taiwan. It particularly ignored what was going on, what Taiwan was doing. Taiwan basically closed its borders straight away, 31st of January. And it's had, I think, 2 deaths in the entire time. But the WHO doesn't want to know anything about Taiwan, doesn't really acknowledge it. And so wouldn't learn any lessons or even really speak to it. So there's 2 big organizations there that really dropped the ball. And it's not for the first time. WHO has dropped the ball on Ebola. It dropped the ball on SARS. It can say with some justification that, you know, if China's going to lie to it, then there's only so much it can do. And there is some truth in that. And we shouldn't use 2020 hindsight with this. However, countries like Taiwan worked it out within kind of 24 hours what was going on. So I don't think it's a great excuse. So what have we seen from these kind of organizations since it began? Well, primarily we've seen them retreat into their comfort zone. They have been so used, and to some extent the public is so used to seeing the great public health threats, the great epidemics, as being the consumption of sugary drinks and people binge drinking, that they found it quite difficult to tear themselves away from that narrative and realize that this is a viral disease. Right, your lifestyle isn't going to make a great deal of difference to it. You can catch it off anyone, and you can give it to anyone. But they've retreated to their comfort zone. You know, so in February, while this disease was really starting to go global, the WHO was going on to long Twitter tirades about vaping. Public Health England's one of their very first pronouncements about this back in March was that if you smoke, you're 14 times more likely to die from COVID-19. It's total rubbish. It came from a tiny study which involved 5 smokers, of whom 3 became seriously ill. You know, the evidence since, as you may know, really quite strongly suggests that smokers are actually less likely to get COVID-19 in the first place. Public Health England, insofar as they responded to this, they put out a report about the risk factors for COVID-19, and it just didn't mention smoking. And it's probably the first report Public Health England have ever done that doesn't mention smoking. But you've really got to kind of read between the lines to have even spotted that. In America at the moment, they're looking at changing the drinking guidelines. The World Health Organization's been going on about alcohol advertising for the last 3 months. So, you know, they haven't been cancelling meetings about this kind of stuff. It's still pushing on. And the reason I don't think we're going to see serious reform, you can see the signs of this already, is that, okay, smoking doesn't seem to be related to COVID-19 particularly. Alcohol certainly isn't, and they'll still say that, you know, it weakens the immune system or what have you, but the evidence is just not there that these 2 major risk factors they go on about for everything else play any significant part with coronavirus. But obesity does. So they found obesity. Vaping doesn't either, by the way. Just to backpedal 1 second. America, once this disease started spreading, because they had this big scare that Eric just mentioned about so-called Uvalde, they were primed to think that that's the real epidemic, right? The youth vaping epidemic is the real problem. Maybe there's some connection with coronavirus. Of course, it wasn't, but it didn't stop them saying, well, we think the people who vape might be more at risk. All nonsense. But obesity is a genuine risk factor, not for getting it, of course, but for having more severe symptoms. But obesity is a risk factor for a lot of things. Your risk of mortality increases anyway if you've got obesity. It's not obvious why the relationship between obesity and COVID-19 makes it any more of a public health threat. Obese people aren't any more contagious, that it's likely to have worse outcomes, but so are all people, so are men. In fact, the increased risk from being obese is pretty similar to the increased risk of being male. But you can see already from Public Health England and other organizations, and indeed Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, has bought into this stuff because he is obese and he did go into intensive care with COVID-19. He's put 2 and 2 together and worked out that must be the reason. So now we're being told in Britain, where we have had one of the highest death rates from COVID and a pretty disastrous response to it, we're now being told that actually it's the public to blame for being fat. And if we want to avoid a second wave, we better have a junk food advertising ban, and we better have higher taxes on milkshakes and so on. So once again, it's the public to blame. It's not the government, it's not the public health lobby, it's the people. And so I don't think there's massive reason to be optimistic about the nanny state going away as a result of this. On the contrary, I mean, if people could put up with lockdowns for months, and they can put up with advertising bans and higher taxes, I think people are being softened up by this to accept perhaps more government intervention in their lifestyles in the name of saving lives. And, Eric before mentioned the fact that this is really a longevity movement. And in practice, a lot of the time, we're just extending the lives of people who are already pretty old. Well, the average age of death from COVID-19 in Britain, so far as I can work it out, the official figure is never actually released, but you can kind of surmise, seems to be 84 years old, which is 3 years older than life expectancy, which is to say that COVID-19 is killing people on average at an older age than all of the causes of death. So, I mean, that's a slight simplification. It does obviously kill a few people at younger age, and there's a possibility of it causing lasting damage. And even if you're old, you wouldn't want to die from COVID-19, don't get me wrong. But there is a lack of perspective going on here. We've lost in Britain, many other countries, liberties on a scale that we've never seen before, including in wartime, in order to try and prevent these deaths. So it's not inconceivable people will tolerate lesser measures in order to prevent supposedly an even greater number of deaths. So there is something to go at here, I think, for libertarians. It's a good thing that Donald Trump has defunded WHO. I think we can be putting forward a positive message and a plan about what needs doing. The Public Health England and similar organizations should be essentially abolished and replaced with something like the Centre for Infectious Disease Control. If people still want no government agency to deal with nanny state stuff, we can call it Nanny State England, but at least people will know where they are. The WHO, our former Prime Minister David Cameron came up with a pretty decent plan actually recently. He acknowledges that WHO has completely failed on this, and implicitly he said that it's unreformable, and I think that's true. I don't think it can be reformed. So he accepts it's still going to be around in some form because some governments will continue funding it, but there needs to be an alternative, and it needs to be something along the lines again of the Global Centre for Infectious Disease Control, an apolitical body that only looks at infectious disease, monitors the world, plans for how to combat them, sees what the emergent threats are, and if the WHO wants to carry on spending time campaigning against vaping, then no one's going to stop it doing that. And if Mike Bloomberg wants to give it money to do so, then it's a free market. But we need to have, I'm not the first to say this, but we need a World Health Organization. We don't need the World Health Organization.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your thoughts. And there is actually a really compelling analogy between what we're seeing with all the COVID and the lockdowns and, believe it or not, the Blitz. And this was not my analogy. This was brought out by somebody else whose name escapes me right now. But they pointed out that people only have a certain amount of tolerance for their lives being disrupted. The cost of that disruption increases exponentially the longer it goes on because we have fewer and fewer resources left to absorb the cost. And people's tolerance for risk actually changes as the situation becomes more serious. If you look at the Blitz, when the bombing first started, everyone went into the bomb shelters. 2 weeks later, they were in the bomb shelters only while the bombs were falling, and then they were straight back out again, you know, buying and selling and getting on with life and visiting friends and helping clean up and so forth. And I hope, I'm going to disagree with you slightly there, Chris, and I look forward to a bit of banter and Q&A at the end of this once we've heard from Kate as well. But my hope is that actually people are their patience is being exhausted by the lockdowns and the things that we're seeing, and that maybe actually we're going to see it push the other way as people start to say, no, actually we tried that and we're not going to let you try it again. I'll give you a chance to respond to that at the very end. For now, we'd love to hear what Kate Andrews has in store for us.
Thank you so much. As Chris just noted at the end, which is, I guess, where I'll pick up, I think it's quite telling that we're having this panel the week that Donald Trump states that he's going to start the process of pulling out of the World Health Organization. Now, personally, I'm loath to mention the president on a panel called Live and Let Live. I'm not convinced that he always shares those values. But it is still an important moment to think about not just what the World Health Organization has done throughout this global pandemic, but also to reflect on what it's become to be able to handle this process so badly and to mess up essentially every step of the way. And I think what both Eric and Chris have, detailed actually quite well is this broad sentiment that if you're going to exist and you're going to get loads of public money from around the world so that one day when a global pandemic comes along, you can be the leader of the response, then you have to do a half-decent job when the global pandemic comes along and when it arrives. And it shows how deeply politicized this issue of public health has become at the international level, and certainly, I think, from the countries that we're speaking from, at the national level as well. And when you politicize public health, it loses its main purpose, which is to actually improve the lifestyles of people, to make them healthier, to make them more prosperous, and most importantly, to keep them alive. So I think the president, a stop clock is right twice a day, is absolutely right. I agree with Chris to be questioning the US's involvement with the World Health Organization. And I'm not talking about it from a defund the police type leftism, which I wouldn't actually be surprised if speakers at this classical liberal libertarian conference could have a very healthy debate about from both sides of the aisle, because at least when we're talking about defund the police, we're often talking about removing authority. You can agree or disagree about whether or not that's right. But when we're talking about defunding the World Health Organization, I think we can broadly be in agreement that this is an authoritarian type of leftism that is desiring to control and oppress those who come across it. And I think that's been summed up in the World Health Organization's response. Chris, I think, covered the highlights well. They were repeating China's talking points as the pandemic spread across the world. I'm not generous at all. I don't even think you need hindsight to be able to say that plenty of countries knew exactly what was happening at the time, that we weren't being told the truth, and yet the WHO was out there parroting the talking points. They waited till the end of January to declare a global pandemic. The University of Southampton did a study fairly recently estimating that if reaction had been different and China had been able to properly lock down 1 or 2 or 3 weeks earlier, the number of cases could have been 66, 86, or 95% less, which could have had a considerable impact on the extent to which it spread and how quickly it spread. And the fact that it left Taiwan out of conferences to tackle the virus, again, just goes to show the point that we're not really talking about public health anymore. We're not really talking about keeping people alive, keeping people safe from the virus. We're talking about politics. But I suppose this is an important moment because we need to stop and look at the World Health Organization, which is supposedly leading from the top. We need to not only look at them, but we need to look at what's happening on the national level, but also on the academic level. And I'm sure Eric can probably speak to this a bit in the Q&A as well. Chris has criticized Public Health England. There are lots of public health bodies to criticize, but it's also the academics who are coming at this from the university perspective, who are producing research that then goes to the public health officials that makes them think that the right way to move forward is to clamp down on all freedoms. I'm thinking back to the Lancet report on food, planet, and health published in January 2019, which got worldwide coverage, which essentially was advocating for the restriction, rationing, and elimination of foods and diets that the authors displeased of. It said specifically that developed countries should offer less than what's currently offered by reducing portions, choice, and packaging. They talked about wars and natural disasters. as opportunities through which the food system could be transformed. I mean, completely thoughtless, lost the plot. And I think when something like COVID-19 hits the world, you start to realize that the academics and many of the public health officials who were tasked with making sure that we would stay safe have actually been creating a body of work and a body of plans that would make all of our lives significantly worse off, that would make us poorer and ultimately probably make us less healthy from many other different perspectives than simply what we put in our mouths. Public Health England here in the UK has been spending nearly double on the obesity epidemic, as Chris referred to it, which, you know, is not really appropriate phrasing, than it actually did on preparing for real epidemics. And it's often the very wealthy and those who are in a position of privilege, really, who are able to come up with these plans. I'm not just focused on the serious public health implications of COVID specifically, but what the knock-on effects are for other kinds of viruses and illnesses around the world as we have gone into lockdown and as we have struggled to get people the care that they need. So obviously, in the light of COVID, you have public health bodies that have completely failed to bring in a successful track and trace scheme. Here in the UK, the government backed its bureaucrats over the tech giants, Google and Apple, who had a tried and tested framework in which we could have created an app around it so people could actually be getting back out there and feel safe. The bureaucrats said, no, we're going to stick to what we feel comfortable with, which is doing this all centrally, and we're going to get it off the ground. Of course, it failed. Of course, they U-turned. And now the UK isn't estimated to have an app to trace the virus until autumn at the earliest. If there were to be a second wave, we could be in a position where we still don't have any resources to tackle it. But about those knock-on effects, the Stop TB Partnership Group released a study in May that estimates that coronavirus could trigger 6.3 million more TB cases between this year and in 5 years' time from now, which would estimate to be 1.4 million tuberculosis deaths. We're looking at potentially double number of the cases of malaria this year in sub-Saharan Africa alone. The disruption of therapy for HIV/AIDS could lead to 500,000 extra deaths in sub-Saharan Africa in the next year alone. It is often these poor public health bodies in developing countries that are trying to target the very serious illnesses that many people across the world still face. And I think often they're supported little, if at all, from the top, where people are much more focused on whether or not people who are wealthier are having that extra glass of wine or smoking that cigarette that they don't want them to have. And it's leading to some absolutely tragic outcomes. And I think that's going to become even more apparent as we come out of severe lockdown when we see the implication for other areas of public health around the world. Now, some public health regimes have been more stress tested than others. Public Health England here in the UK is relatively new, launched in 2013. This was its first test, its first meaningful test anyway, and it badly failed. You compare that to something like the Center for Health Protection as part of the Department of Health in Hong Kong, which is thought to have made many mistakes during the SARS pandemic, but actually got its act together and was in a much better place to handle COVID-19. I think the feelings about the Food and Drug Administration over in the UK are fairly mixed. They made so many errors during the HIV pandemic in the 80s that they have been more proactive about trialing drugs this time around, but of course criticized for trying to halt certain kinds of testing programs that were funded by Bill Gates in the private sector. So I think that the jury's still out on that one. I know here in the UK, the chat amongst Whitehall is that Public Health England is in real trouble, and that it may well not survive, certainly not as we know it now. But I happen to agree with Chris. I think that the public health officials are going to be quite opportunistic given everything we've just been through. Here in the UK, especially compared to the rest of Europe, but certainly around the world, we have seen people truly terrified of the impact of this virus. Now, much of that is understandable, but even as the virus has gotten under control here in the UK, unless you're in one particular region, you're very unlikely at this point to come into contact with COVID-19. People are still extremely judgmental of other people's behavior, even once it's become legal again. We are now able to go out to restaurants and pubs, but many people will criticize you, saying you are putting their lives and their families' lives at risk for doing so. And I think that is exactly the kind of narrative that public health officials can feed off of, because it was very, very clear before that if you were overweight or obese, you didn't live a healthy lifestyle, that was a personal private health issue, not really a public health issue. Now, I would argue it is still a private health issue because we know that on average, being obese really does not cost your healthcare service much more. And as Chris says, it doesn't, well, you might be more badly impacted by the virus. It's not obvious that there's a knock-on effect to that for other people. People are now going to start to use other people's lifestyles as a stick with which to beat them, unfortunately. That was at the height of lockdown, sitting in a park to get some sun. Now that's going to be how you live your life and whether or not it fits into what would be considered to be the safest person if something like a coronavirus were to strike again. So I'm very concerned about how we're going to move forward. At the moment, perhaps it's too soon, but I think there's going to be hesitation to blame the spread of the pandemic specifically on healthcare services that probably should have had more capacity, that probably should have been better prepared for what was going to come, and more of a focus on individuals and what they could be doing to prevent a virus that, frankly, in many ways is out of our control. Thanks.
Wow, well, thank you very much. And between particularly yourself and Chris, you're painting a little bit of a bleak picture. Now, I know Kirsty's got some questions, but Chris, I did promise you that I would give you specifically the chance to respond to my disagreement now with both you and Kate, it turns out. So clearly, given that you are the subject matter experts, I'm almost certainly wrong. But I'm going to put my case very briefly anyway and then let you respond. That certainly in Australia and in Victoria, as I've been listening, just take the people that I play tennis with as an example, the first lockdown, it was all about, oh, isn't it so terrible? This virus is so scary. Isn't it great that the government is doing something? And when the second lockdown came in, I went to tennis expecting for the last lesson that I was going to get in just before the new lockdowns came in, and then we couldn't play tennis. I was expecting much the same thing, or even potentially anger at all these irresponsible people who've been spreading the disease. And actually the tone was much more one of, ugh, I just want to get back to life, which almost caught me off guard. Are you not seeing that in the UK? Is that a uniquely Australian phenomenon, or perhaps even just a fluke of who I happen to be around?
Possibly. I think it would be a struggle for the government to introduce a second lockdown, particularly in winter. We were very lucky with the weather during our lockdown, sunniest spring on record. So, yeah, I think that would be a challenge for the government. But in terms of people being more, sanguine about things, not at all. I mean, I tweeted a picture of my lunch the other day. I went to the pub for lunch because I wanted to prove that I was doing my bit for the British economy. We're all being encouraged to eat out. And aside from some crazy comments from wokeists about how it was a toxic discourse, there were a lot of people replying along the lines of, I'm killing my grandparents or other people's grandparents by even being in a pub. And a surprising number just saying that's a really unhealthy it was an all-day breakfast. That's a really unhealthy lunch. You're going to have a heart attack. You're going to put pressure on the National Health Service. So I'm not seeing much evidence of it. And admittedly, maybe that's a bit anecdotal, but only 5% of people in this country went to the pubs last weekend, and that was the first time they've been open for 3.5 months. 60% of people said they would feel very uncomfortable going out at all.
Can I just say I am so glad that your ancestors threw my ancestors into prison and sent them off to the colonies, because I think even with the second lockdown, it sounds like maybe I'd rather be around my people here than putting up with what you have to put up with there.
It's interesting the extent to which the response has been different, even in mainland Europe. So the UK has been the most cautious coming out of lockdown. As Chris says, the polling every step of the way is almost always that Brits think the government's moving too fast, even though in some cases we're weeks or a month behind other parts of Europe. But then if you look to mainland Europe, there is a lot more economic activity. Job vacancies are rising again. Employment, we're not so sure yet, but things are looking slightly more hopeful. So I think the attitude of the public has a huge implication, not only for coming out of lockdown, but the public health narrative and the policies that are going to be implemented after.
Wow, okay, thank you. And do we have some questions?
Yeah, so firstly, I've got a question for Chris, actually. What powers has the government, with the COVID crisis, what powers do you think these large health organisations and the government will actually hang on to? Will they let go of them once this crisis part is actually over, do you think?
Oh, well, that's the big fear, of course, from day one. I mean, the Coronavirus Act and the associated regulations in this country, as I said, they are totally unprecedented, both in peacetime and wartime. They're meant to be in place for 2 years. They are renewed it was 3 weeks, and it was extended to 4 weeks. They're renewed every 4 weeks by one person the Secretary of Health. The Parliament has a look at it about a month later. But I mean, this is pretty scary stuff. I don't think that the government wishes to keep people in lockdown permanently, but it is perfectly conceivable that they will keep little bits of it, certainly until some kind of vaccine arrives. You know, libertarians are well aware that the government doesn't tend to, throw away powers once it's gained them. You know, we saw this over the course of the First World War and the Second World War. We never really got rid of the pub opening hours introduced in the First World War until the 1980s. So yeah, it's obviously a concern.
For each of the panel, I guess, whoever wants to answer. So the panel agrees that the government is taking numbers are not based on actual numbers and other trade-offs. Question remains unanswered. Sorry, they've given it to me in funny words. What is their motive and why is this happening? What is actually driving this government response?
I tend to think that the simplest answer is almost always the right one. And I think in many of these cases, it's not sinister, it's incompetence. And also genuinely worry that if any government gets one step wrong, that they will be blamed for the death toll. And, you know, that's true. The governments are in charge right now. They have taken unprecedented power. If they make the wrong mistakes, then they are the ones to be blamed. And I think that means we have seen a very, very cautious approach, certainly in the UK, but elsewhere too. I think America perhaps is an exception to this in terms of developed countries, where people don't want to give those powers back to the people yet because they're concerned that if there were to be an increase in the R number, for example, that the government would be blamed. I completely agree, however, that metrics are being looked at and used in particular ways to probably make this into a long game. Sometimes the R number does not tell us everything that it should. For example, here in England, the R number ticked up slightly yesterday, but actually, if you look at the number of infections, they decreased by 1,000 compared to the previous week. So it's not all so straightforward. And unfortunately, once you do hand over those powers, you often have to fight slightly harder to take them back. So I agree with Chris that there's a worry here, but as I said, often I don't think it's totally sinister. I think it might just be incompetence and slow moving that we often see from bureaucrats.
Well, thank you all very much. You got one more?
I've actually got two very quick questions.
Okay.
If we've got time.
Quick questions and quick answers.
Very, very quick questions. I'm just going to go to each of the panelists. We're going to start with you first, Eric. Without admitting that they're actually good, what are the least bad of the various nanny state regulations? Quick answer, on the spot. We're going to go to Eric first.
The least bad, standard drink labeling on beer so you can find your best value. You can very quickly figure out the cheapest drink.
That's great. And then the second question, this is from John Humphreys himself. If forced to ban something, what would you ban?
Who's this to?
To you, Eric. We're going to do it to all.
Forced to ban something that isn't already banned, or is it like, what's the last thing that you would unban? I'd rather go that way.
Let's go that way.
You can change it. We can do what we like here. We're libertarians.
I think that the last thing that I would unban would be the riskiest form of every way of getting high that there is.
Okay.
Okay. Now to you, Chris. What do you think is the least bad of all the nanny state regulations?
I think I don't know. I think they're all bad. I kind of go with Eric on labeling. If you consider that to be nanny state regulation, I actually don't. I'm in favor of calorie labeling on alcohol, for example. I think that's the kind of thing is perfectly reasonable for to be on there. It's on food. It's kind of useful to people. Maybe if that's a nanny state regulation, then yeah, that kind of stuff.
And if you had the ban hammer, what would you ban?
The last thing you would unban.
The last thing I would unban, if I could ban something new and I wasn't a libertarian, probably big suitcases with wheels on them. I think if you're going to carry a lot of luggage, you should be able to physically carry it.
When they're trying to all shove them in the top there, yes.
Yeah, it's all great carrying your own body weight until you get to a set of stairs,
And to you, Kate, what do you think is least bad of all the nanny state regulations?
So I think in many countries, including the UK, tobacco is taxed too high, but having a higher tax on tobacco actually does give smokers the ability to say that they pay their way when it comes to healthcare, especially if you have a nationalized service like you do in the UK. You can't touch them. What would I ban? I mean, if I were a real authoritarian, I hate incense. It gives me a headache when you walk past the shops and stuff. It makes Why not just go for a nice like floral candle? So yeah, maybe incense.
Yeah. I'm with you on that, Kate. Like,
but I wouldn't ban it.
Go past those
people
stores.
should do what they want.
Although my mum probably uses incense almost every day.
There's a big issue with secondhand incense. It's got to be a health risk, right?
Please, would you stop giving these people ideas?
I am a passive incense inhaler.
These people do not need more ideas. Look, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. Chris, Kate, and Eric, really appreciate you joining us and giving us your thoughts on what really is an extremely topical issue. I'm feeling slightly less optimistic now, actually. It seems that my optimism may have been misplaced. But look, I really appreciate your insight, and thank you so much for giving us your time and being a part of the 24 Hours of Freedom.
Thank you so much.